The moment 19-year-old Lucia Mendoza heard the trunk click shut above her, sealing her into darkness that smelled of motor oil and someone else's fear, she understood that the promised wife had been lie as empty as the space where another human should have been sitting in the passenger seat. 5 hours. That's how long she spent folded into a space designed for spare tires and grocery bags. Not human beings with lungs that needed air and hearts that hammered against ribs like prisoners trying to escape their own bodies. 5 hours of breathing through a piece of garden hose that the man had punched through the trunk's wall, her only connection to the world beyond her metal coffin. When the trunk finally opened in that isolated cabin 40 miles from anywhere, and the man's face appeared above her with a smile that belonged in nightmares, Lucia knew that crossing the border had been the easy part. The real test would be surviving what came after, when promises of help transformed into something darker than any Border Patrol detention center. But to understand how a university student from Managua ended up in a car trunk at the El Paso crossing, believing she was part of an elaborate marital deception, you need to go back 3 weeks to when desperation made even obvious lies sound like reasonable plans. Nicaragua had become impossible for anyone who dared to dream of change. The government's crackdown on student protesters had transformed universities from places of learning into hunting grounds. Lucia had made the mistake of attending one rally, holding one sign, believing that her generation could demand better. The photo of her at the protest, spread across social media, had marked her as an enemy of the state. The first arrest was a warning. 3 days in a cell designed to break spirits through isolation and intimidation. The second would be permanent. Her cellmates had whispered. Young women who challenged the government had a way of disappearing into prisons where even their families couldn't find them. At 19, with dreams of becoming a teacher, Lucia faced a choice between flight and a fate that made death seem merciful. Her family scraped together $6,000, selling her grandmother's jewelry, her father's truck, taking loans from relatives who understood that political asylum was worth any debt. It wasn't much by smuggling standards, but would get her to America where she could apply for protection, tell her story to authorities who might care about students being hunted for holding signs. The Coyote Network in Managua operated through whispers and recommendations. Through her uncle's friend's cousin, Lucia connected with someone who specialized in vulnerable cases, young women traveling alone who needed extra protection. The man who met her at a coffee shop near the university didn't look like the smuggler she'd imagined. Roberto was clean-shaven, well-dressed, spoke like an educated person. He showed photos of other young women he'd helped reach safety, shared testimonials that seemed genuine. His plan was creative, designed to avoid the dangers solo women faced. Lucia would travel as part of a married couple, his wife serving as both companion and camouflage. Border agents were less suspicious of families. A young couple visiting relatives was mundane, forgettable. No dangerous desert crossings or river swims. They'd drive through the checkpoint with documents that would pass casual inspection. $6,000 covered everything. Transportation to the border, the false documents, the crossing itself, and delivery to Austin where Lucia had a contact from a Nicaraguan exile community. Roberto's wife Maria would meet them in Ciudad Juarez, and the three would cross together at El Paso. Simple, safe, smart. The journey to the Mexican border took a week, moving by bus through Guatemala and Mexico with documents Roberto had provided. Lucia traveled alone, but felt protected by the plan waiting at the end. Each mile north was a mile further from cells and disappearances, closer to the country where protesting didn't mark you for destruction. In Juarez, Roberto met her at the bus station as promised. Still well-dressed, still reassuring, explaining that Maria was preparing for the crossing, getting her hair done to match the passport photo. They'd meet tomorrow morning for the actual crossing. Tonight, Lucia would stay at a safe hotel, rest, prepared to play the role of Roberto's sister-in-law visiting from Nicaragua. The hotel was decent, the room private, the lock solid. Lucia spent the night practicing her cover story, imagining questions border agents might ask, responses that would sound natural. She was visiting her sister Maria and brother-in-law Roberto in El Paso. 2 weeks vacation. Here's a return ticket. Normal, boring, forgettable. By tomorrow night, she'd be in America, safe from the hunters in Managua. Morning came with Roberto at her door, apologizing for a change in plans. Maria had food poisoning, too sick to make the crossing. But they couldn't wait. The documents were date-specific, the window of opportunity narrow. He had another solution, not ideal but workable. Lucia would cross hidden in his car, just to the checkpoint transit. Once through, she could emerge and they'd continue normally. The red flags were obvious in hindsight. Where was Maria really? Why couldn't they wait one day? Why did the backup plan seem so ready, as if it had always been the real plan? But Lucia was 19, alone in a border town, with Nicaraguan security forces possibly tracking her. The fear of what lay behind outweighed the fear of what lay ahead. Roberto's car was newish, American plates from Texas, the kind of vehicle that crossed borders daily without suspicion. He showed her the trunk, spacious for a trunk, with a blanket laid down, bottles of water, even a battery-powered fan for air circulation. The garden hose air tube seemed like thoughtful preparation. It would be uncomfortable, but brief. 20 minutes through the checkpoint, then freedom. He helped her fold herself into the space, arranging limbs in ways that would become agony within minutes. The trunk closed with finality that triggered immediate panic. Darkness absolute except for a tiny LED light he'd left her. Air that already felt insufficient. The blanket that was supposed to provide comfort, instead, made her feel like she was lying in her own grave. The car started moving. Through the metal, Lucia could hear muffled traffic sounds. Roberto's music playing seemed normal. She tried to track their progress. Stops that might be traffic lights. The longer pause that must be the approach to the checkpoint. Her heart hammered so hard, she was certain it would shake the entire vehicle. Alert every drug dog and agent to her presence. Time became elastic in the trunk. Had 20 minutes passed? 30? An hour? The air tube provided oxygen, but not relief from the growing heat. The fan's batteries died within minutes, leaving her in stifling stillness. The water bottles, impossible to drink from while horizontal, mocked her growing thirst. This wasn't 20 minutes. This was something else entirely. When the car finally stopped after what felt like hours, Lucia prepared for the trunk to open, for Roberto's apologetic face explaining some delay. Instead, she heard him on the phone, speaking English she couldn't fully understand, laughing, casual, no urgency about the human being slowly cooking in his trunk. The car started again, drove further, still no freedom. The second stop brought footsteps around the car. The trunk opened, flooding her with light that stabbed eyes adjusted to darkness. But they weren't at any border facility or safe house. Trees surrounded them, a cabin visible in the distance, no other signs of civilization. Roberto's face appeared above her, still smiling but differently now. The mask had slipped, revealing something that made her skin crawl despite the heat. He helped her out with fake gentleness, her legs too cramped to support her weight. 5 hours in the trunk had left her dehydrated, disoriented, muscles screaming from confinement. He half carried her to the cabin, still playing some version of caretaker, offering water, apologizing for the long journey, saying traffic had been terrible but they'd made it safely. Inside the cabin, reality crystallized with horrible clarity. No Maria, no sister-in-law story, no relatives in El Paso, just a remote building with locks on the windows and a bed that dominated the main room. Roberto's demeanor shifted completely, the educated veneer dropping to reveal something ancient and predatory. The debt, he explained, wasn't just the $6,000 she'd paid. That had covered transport, documents, risks taken. But now she owed for the crossing itself, for his protection, for the cabin rental. Another $10,000. Did she have family who could pay? No. Well, there were other ways young women could earn money. He'd help her, of course. He knew people. Arrangements could be made. Lucia's mind, sharp despite exhaustion, processed the trap's elegant construction. The wife who never existed, ensuring she'd trust him. The trunk that isolated her, made her dependent on him for freedom. The remote location that prevented escape or calls for help. Even her phone, confiscated for safety before the trunk journey, ensuring she couldn't call for help. When Roberto went to use the bathroom, still confident in her exhaustion and disorientation, Lucia made her choice. The window in the kitchen was locked but old, with frame rotted by desert weather. She grabbed a cast iron pan and smashed through glass, and with movements powered by terror. Cut her hands climbing through, left blood trails that would make tracking easy. But she ran anyway. The desert around the cabin was scrub and sand, but a dirt road led somewhere. She followed it, barefoot since her shoes were in Roberto's car, feet bleeding within minutes. Behind her, she heard the bathroom door slam, Roberto shouts, a car engine starting. But adrenaline gave her speed, and desperation gave her endurance. A main road appeared after what felt like miles, but was probably less than one. Real traffic, real people, witnesses. A gas station glowed like salvation. Lucia burst through the doors, bloody and wild-eyed, speaking rapid Spanish to a startled clerk who probably saw desperate people regularly, but rarely this desperate. The clerk, a middle-aged Mexican-American woman, took one look and understood, called 911, locked the doors, gave Lucia water and a towel for her bleeding feet, spoke calm Spanish, asking no questions about immigration status or how she'd ended up bloody and barefoot on a Texas highway. Just human kindness in the face of obvious human cruelty. Police arrived before Roberto, though Lucia watched the road with terror until uniformed officers surrounded her. They took her statement, sent units to the cabin, found it already abandoned. Roberto had vanished, probably across the border within hours, ready to set the same trap for another desperate young woman fleeing something worse than his plans. The aftermath was complicated. Lucia was in America illegally, having crossed in a trunk rather than through proper channels. But she was also a victim of attempted trafficking, a witness to crimes that made her valuable to law enforcement. The asylum claim she planned to make became tangled with victim visas, witness protection, the complex bureaucracy of being saved from one danger while navigating others. A detention center held her for 2 months while lawyers argued her case. Better than Roberto's cabin, but still imprisonment. The other women there shared similar stories. Promised one thing, delivered another, saved by luck or violence or the kindness of strangers. The border was full of Roberts. They warned. Men who specialized in trust, who built elaborate lies to isolate victims, who counted on desperation, making people ignore obvious warnings. Eventually, Lucia was released to a nonprofit that helped trafficking victims. They found her housing, therapy, legal support for her asylum claim. The trauma manifested in unexpected ways. Claustrophobia so severe she couldn't ride elevators. Panic attacks triggered by car trunks glimpsed in parking lots. Nightmares where the garden hose air tube was blocked and she suffocated in darkness. She testified about Roberto to investigators who seemed unsurprised by the wife who never existed scheme. Common tactic, they said, build trust with family narratives, isolate victims from promised protectors, create dependence through confinement. Roberto was one of many, probably using different names, definitely still hunting vulnerable women at border towns. 3 years later, Lucia lived in Austin. The asylum claim had been approved based on the original persecution in Nicaragua combined with the trafficking attempt. She worked at a restaurant, took night classes, built something resembling the life she'd imagined, but parts of her remained in that trunk, in that cabin. In the moment she'd realized the wife was fiction and she was alone with a predator. She volunteered with organizations that helped other asylum seekers, teaching them to recognize the Roberts of the world, the too perfect plans, the convenient sick relatives, the isolation tactics disguised as safety measures. Her story became a warning, though she knew desperate people would still climb into trunks if it meant escaping something worse. Sometimes she wondered about Maria, the fictional wife. Had she ever existed? Was she another victim, used once and discarded? Or had she always been imagination, a ghost conjured to make young women trust a man who specialized in betrayal? The not knowing haunted her as much as the memories of the trunk. Roberto was never caught, probably still operating, still meeting desperate young women in coffee shops, still promising safe passage with his non-existent wife. The cabin was abandoned, just one of many he probably used. The car with a modified trunk probably crossed borders daily, carrying cargo that trusted promises that were lies from conception. Lucia had survived by smashing through a window, leaving blood and skin on broken glass, running barefoot through desert toward the kindness of strangers. Others wouldn't be so lucky, wouldn't find gas stations and good people, wouldn't escape the remote places where promises turn into prisons. She crossed the border in a trunk, believing a wife waited in a passenger seat. Instead, she'd found America through violence and flight, through the failure of elaborate lies and the success of desperate escape. The physical scars on her feet had healed. The psychological scars of 5 hours in darkness, breathing through a garden hose while a predator drove her toward isolation, those remained. Sometimes, in Austin traffic, she'd see car trunks and remember the click of it closing, the absolute darkness, the growing certainty that something was wrong, the moment it opened to reveal not checkpoint safety, but cabin isolation, the smile on Roberto's face that belonged in nightmares she still had. He'd said she'd cross with his wife. There had been no wife, just a trunk and a trap and a young woman who trusted the wrong story. Lucia had made it to America, built a life, found safety, but part of her remained in that trunk, breathing through a garden hose, waiting for promises to transform into threats they'd always been. $6,000. 5 hours in darkness. One window smashed in desperation. That was the mathematics of her crossing, calculated by a man who turned trust into a weapon and wives into fiction. Lucia had survived the equation, solved for escape through broken glass and bloodied feet. Others were still calculating, still trusting, still climbing into trunks believing that wives waited in passenger seats and safety waited at journey's end. The border was full of Roberts and fictional Mariahs, of trunks modified for human cargo and cabins prepared for human captivity. Lucia had escaped one trap, found America through its shattered window. She was free but forever marked by the hours she'd spent folded into darkness, breathing through a tube, trusting a lie shaped like a family that had never existed at all.